Eleanor Hayes, now 74 years old, looks back on a life defined by sacrifice, perseverance, and quiet dignity. For over 5 decades, she worked as a seamstress in a modest workshop at the edge of town. The rhythmic sound of her sewing machine became the soundtrack of her days, while the smell of fabric, sometimes freshly dyed, sometimes aged and worn, lingered in the walls of her little home. To Eleanor, work was not only a means of survival, but also a statement of who she was. A woman who believed in the dignity of labor and the worth of every honest effort. Her husband, George, embodied a similar spirit. Gentle and kind-hearted, he often reminded their children that true strength lay not in wealth or status, but in compassion and integrity. Together, Eleanor and George created a household where hard work and love were intertwined. Their 3 children, David, Mark, and Lisa, grew up surrounded by the hum of the sewing machine, the smell of wood and soil from the farm, and their father's stories of fairness and kindness. But even within this nurturing environment, cracks began to show. From a young age, David displayed a restlessness that set him apart from his siblings. While Mark eagerly helped George with farm chores and Lisa sat beside her mother learning to stitch simple patterns, David would wrinkle his nose at the dust, the sweat, and the simplicity of their lives. He mocked the calloused hands of his mother, calling them ugly, and often asked why she didn't choose a better job that didn't leave her smelling of fabric and dye. As he grew older, David's disdain only deepened. Unlike Mark, who found pride in building with his hands, or Lisa, who admired her mother's patience and skill, David craved something grander. He dreamed not of modest stability, but of power, recognition, and wealth. When he eventually founded a construction company, his ambition bore fruit. Financial success came quickly, and with it, a new sense of superiority. No longer the insecure boy of his youth, David transformed into a man blinded by pride. Instead of honoring his roots, he erased them. He belittled Eleanor in public, sneering at the smell of old fabric that still clung to her clothes, dismissing her as backward and out of place. To him, his mother's values represented a world he had outgrown, a world he wanted to bury under the gleaming towers he built. For Eleanor, these wounds cut deep. She had stitched every torn sleeve of his childhood, stayed awake through the night to finish orders just to buy his school books, and prayed with trembling hands for his health whenever fever struck. And yet, the very hands that once cradled and protected him had become the subject of his scorn. It was in those moments that Eleanor began to realize, while she had built her life on love and sacrifice, her son had chosen a different path, one paved with arrogance, greed, and a denial of the very foundation that had raised him. The rhythm of Eleanor's quiet life shattered the day George passed away. Pancreatic cancer had consumed him swiftly, leaving Eleanor stunned at how fragile even the strongest man could be. George had been her anchor, steady, dependable, a partner who shared her burdens without complaint. His death left a hollow silence in the farmhouse, a silence that deepened with every tick of the clock, every creak of the wooden floor. The funeral was modest but heartfelt. Neighbors and old friends gathered, offering food, prayers, and whispered words of condolence. Eleanor sat by George's casket, her hands trembling as she traced the wood grain, unwilling to let go of the man who had stood by her through every storm. Tears blurred her vision, but even in that haze, she noticed David standing nearby. Unlike his brother Mark, who wept openly, or Lisa, who clung to her mother's side, David's expression was carefully composed, his eyes dry, his mouth set in a solemn line. After the ceremony, David approached her with calculated gentleness. He placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking in a voice smooth and practiced. "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of everything from now on." The words, at first, felt like a lifeline to Eleanor, who was drowning in grief. She believed, perhaps for the first time in years, that David might be ready to step into his father's shoes, to shoulder responsibility with honor. But that comfort was short-lived. Within days, David began to press his influence. He insisted that the farmhouse, isolated and old, was too dangerous for Eleanor to live in alone. He painted vivid pictures of accidents, her falling on the stairs, strangers breaking in, the loneliness eating away at her sanity. With a steady stream of persuasion, he urged her to move into his city home, where he promised she would be safe, cared for, and surrounded by family. Still reeling from George's death, Eleanor relented. She packed her sewing machine, a few photographs, and the worn quilt she had stitched decades ago. With heavy steps, she left the farmhouse, a place filled with memories of laughter, meals at the wooden table, and nights spent sewing while George hummed old tunes. She told herself it was temporary, that David's promise of safety was genuine. Weeks later, however, the mask slipped. One morning, David entered her room holding a neat stack of documents. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he explained that managing finances would be easier if everything were centralized. He asked for her identification papers, her bank information, and even the deed to the farmhouse. "Just trust me, Mom," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It'll simplify everything. You don't need to worry about details anymore. I'll handle it all." Eleanor hesitated, clutching the folder of documents she had safeguarded for years. She remembered George's warnings about always keeping her name on the deed, about never signing papers she didn't fully understand. But grief clouded her judgment, and David's reassurances sounded like the voice of reason in her vulnerable state. In that moment, Eleanor didn't realize she was surrendering not only her security, but also the very legacy she and George had built together. It was the first step into a web of deception carefully spun by the son she had once cradled in her arms. The promise of safety in David's home quickly dissolved into something darker. Eleanor, once the heart of her farmhouse, became little more than an unwelcome guest in her son's grand city house. The first weeks carried an uncomfortable tension. David's wife barely spoke to her, his children avoided eye contact, and Eleanor felt as though she were a shadow drifting through hallways that no longer echoed with warmth. David, emboldened by the power he held, dropped all pretense of kindness. The affectionate tone he used at the funeral was replaced by open cruelty. He called her a useless old hag during dinner, sometimes in front of his children, who stared silently at their plates, too afraid to defend their grandmother. He restricted where she could go in the house, locking doors and reminding her that she had no say in his household. Eleanor, who once kept her family together with quiet resilience, was now treated as nothing more than a burden. Unwanted, invisible, disposable. Her unease grew when she noticed strange activity in her bank accounts. Receipts for large withdrawals began arriving, amounts she had never authorized. Late one evening, while walking past David's office, she overheard his voice on the phone, low and sharp. "Everything is in my name now. Soon it will all be mine." The words pierced her like a blade. She realized then that her son's reassurances had been nothing but calculated lies. Summoning courage, Eleanor confronted David the next morning at the breakfast table. Her voice trembled as she demanded to know what he had done with her money, with the deed to the farmhouse, with everything she and George had built over a lifetime. David only laughed, his smirk dripping with contempt. He leaned back in his chair and declared, "It's all mine now. You're nothing but a burden. Be grateful I even let you stay here." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Memories of George's steady voice echoed in her mind, his insistence that family meant loyalty, protection, love. Yet here she was, betrayed by her own blood. She felt the crushing weight of helplessness, but also the flicker of anger beginning to stir beneath her grief. The final blow came at dawn. David woke her abruptly, ordering her to get dressed. Without explanation, he drove her out of the city, the roads narrowing into lonely paths surrounded by forest. Eleanor sat silently in the passenger seat, clutching her small handbag, sensing with every mile that something irreversible was about to happen. At last, the car stopped before a decrepit shack, a structure half collapsed, its windows broken, its roof sagging under years of neglect. David opened the trunk, yanked out a small suitcase containing a few of her belongings, and hurled it onto the dirt. His voice was cold and merciless as he sneered, "This is what you deserve, you useless old hag. Now fend for yourself." Without another glance, he climbed back into the car and sped away, leaving Eleanor in the wilderness, abandoned like refuse. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in her life, Eleanor stood completely alone, stripped of her home, her possessions, and even her son's respect. Yet as she looked at the collapsing shack before her, something inside whispered that this might not be the end, but the beginning of a battle she never expected to fight. The shack David abandoned her in was barely standing. Its walls cracked, its roof leaking whenever rain fell, and its windows long gone, leaving only jagged frames where glass once was. Eleanor sat on the floor that first night, her suitcase by her side, listening to the sounds of the forest creeping in through the gaps. Cold wind gnawed at her bones, and for the first time in her life she felt truly discarded, like an object thrown away after years of use. At first, despair consumed her. She thought of George, of the warmth of their farmhouse, and of the nights they had sat together sharing stories by lamplight. Tears fell freely as she whispered his name into the silence. For days, she barely ate, surviving on scraps from her bag and the few coins left in her pocket. Hunger hollowed her, and hopelessness pressed against her chest like a weight too heavy to bear. But Eleanor was not a woman who stayed broken for long. She had survived poverty as a girl, endured sleepless nights stitching clothes to feed her children, and borne the grief of losing the man she loved most. Slowly, her sorrow gave way to something sharper: anger. And with it came dignity. She refused to let her life end in that ruin, forgotten like some stray animal. With shaky steps, she began walking the dirt road that led to the nearest village. The journey was long and her legs ached, but she pressed on, driven by the memory of George's voice reminding her that dignity was not in what one had, but in how one endured. In the village, she approached doors humbly, asking if anyone needed help. Some turned her away, but others offered her small tasks: cleaning kitchens, mending clothes, tending gardens. They paid her with coins, food, and sometimes just kind words. Yet each gesture was a lifeline. Among these encounters, Eleanor recognized an old acquaintance, Mr. Wallace, a retired carpenter who had once worked alongside George. His face lit up with recognition when he saw her, and unlike others who pitied her, he treated her with the respect due to an old friend. He offered her meals, a place to rest when needed, and most importantly, reassurance that she was not invisible. Through the compassion of these villagers, Eleanor began to feel the stirrings of hope once more. With every task completed, with every kind word exchanged, she regained pieces of herself that David had tried to strip away. She started repairing the shack, using scraps of wood and nails gifted by Mr. Wallace, turning the ruin into something livable. Each improvement, however small, felt like a declaration that she was still here, still standing. It was during one of these visits to the village that Eleanor overheard whispers about David. The once booming construction company he had boasted about was faltering. Rumors spread that debts were piling up, contracts were failing, and investors were withdrawing. Workers complained of not being paid on time, and some predicted the company would collapse entirely. As she listened quietly from the corner of the shop, Eleanor felt no immediate triumph, only a solemn recognition of how quickly arrogance could crumble. Yet deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The son who had cast her aside so cruelly was finally approaching a reckoning. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor no longer felt powerless. The first call came in the late afternoon, when Eleanor was mending an old coat for a neighbor in exchange for bread. The sharp ring of her outdated phone startled her. It had been silent for weeks, almost forgotten at the bottom of her bag. She answered hesitantly, only to hear a voice she had once known well, but now sounded broken. "David's." "Mom," he said, his tone strained, almost frantic. "Please, I need you." For a brief moment, Eleanor froze. The same son who had thrown her away like rubbish was now addressing her with desperation. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another, about contracts collapsing, investors withdrawing, lawsuits looming. His construction company, the empire he had built on arrogance and betrayal, was on the verge of total ruin. But Eleanor said nothing. Her silence pressed against him harder than any words could. She ended the call without response. The next day, the phone rang again. Then again, and again. Over the course of less than a week, David called more than 40 times. Each time his voice grew weaker, his pride eroded by panic. Messages filled the inbox. Apologies, please, promises, I know I was wrong. Please forgive me. Mom, I need your advice. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. Eleanor listened to some of them late at night, sitting by the dim light of a lantern in her half-repaired shack. Each message carried the weight of irony. The same man who once called her a useless old hag was now clawing at the edges of her forgiveness, desperate for the wisdom he had mocked. Still, she did not answer. It wasn't cruelty that guided her silence. It was clarity. For the first time, she recognized that David needed her more than she needed him. At last, unable to bear her silence, David appeared at the shack himself. Eleanor saw his car pull up, its polished surface dulled by dust. When he stepped out, she barely recognized him. His suit was wrinkled, his shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. This was no longer the proud, domineering man who had cast her aside. This was a son stripped of his power, laid bare by failure. He stumbled toward her, then fell to his knees in the dirt outside the shack. His voice cracked as he begged, "I know I was wrong. I know I treated you terribly. But please, if you don't help me, I'll lose everything. I don't know what to do anymore. The sight stirred something in Eleanor, but not pity. Not yet. Instead, it was a deep, solemn realization. The balance of power had shifted completely. The son who had once abandoned her to rot in the ruins now knelt before her, his empire collapsing, his pride shattered. For the first time in years, Eleanor did not feel like a burden. She felt strong, needed, seen. And in that moment, she understood that the story of her life was no longer one of quiet suffering. It was becoming one of justice. When David knelt before her, begging for help, Eleanor did not respond with anger or tears. Instead, she studied him quietly, her face calm, her hands folded in her lap. For years, he had spoken to her with contempt, spitting words that cut deeper than any blade. Now those very insults returned to her lips, not in bitterness, but in measured, deliberate truth. "Useless old hag," she repeated softly, echoing his cruelty. "A burden, backward. That's what you called me, David. And now, here you are, kneeling before the very woman you cast aside." Her words struck him harder than any slap. He lowered his eyes, shame flooding his expression, but Eleanor offered no hand to lift him. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them until David finally stood, defeated, and left without another word. In the days that followed, Eleanor's resolve only grew. She knew forgiveness could not be given cheaply, not when her dignity had been trampled so carelessly. But justice, she realized, could take many forms. With the help of the villagers who had become her lifeline, she was introduced to Mr. Sterling, a seasoned lawyer with a sharp mind and a gentle respect for Eleanor's struggle. Through long conversations by candlelight, Mr. Sterling explained that the shack David had abandoned her in, forgotten, neglected, left to rot, could by law become hers through adverse possession. By living there, repairing it, and treating it as her own, she had established a rightful claim stronger than David's paper ownership. What was once meant as her prison could now become her sanctuary. The knowledge lit a fire in Eleanor's heart. For the first time since George's death, she felt control returning to her life, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had rebuilt with her own hands. When David returned weeks later, he carried a folder stuffed with documents. His voice was brittle, desperate, as he urged her to sign. "Mom, if you'll just put your name here, we can fix this. It'll help me settle everything. Don't you want to make things right?" But Eleanor was no longer the grieving widow who had surrendered her papers in blind trust. She stood firm, her gaze steady as she pushed the documents back toward him. "It's too late, David," she said, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving. "You took everything from me, but in the end, I found myself again. What I have now is mine, not because you gave it, but because I fought to keep it." David's hands shook as he gathered the papers, realizing the truth. The power he once wielded over her was gone. His empire was collapsing, and the mother he had abandoned was no longer a victim, but a woman who had reclaimed her dignity. Eleanor did not celebrate his downfall with vengeance. Instead, she allowed herself a quiet, steady pride. Justice, for her, was not in watching David suffer. It was in standing tall again, in proving that even when discarded, she could rise, rebuild, and remind the world of her worth. And as she sat by the repaired window of her shack, watching the sunset cast gold across the trees, Eleanor whispered a final truth to herself. This was not merely survival. This was victory.